Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Today's episode is a little something special. We've pulled together highlights from 6 different episodes, some of our absolute favorites, to give you a mix of inspiration, insight, and a little rejuvenation for your week. If any of these clips speak to you, I've popped the links to the full episodes in the show notes below, so you can dive deeper later. All right, everybody, let's jump in.
What actually is involved in detoxification properly and correctly?
It's a good question. Okay. So there's kind of 3 phases to the detoxification process, I would say. 2 or 3. So the first phase, and we talked about this already, toxins being in storage, right? I won't repeat all that again. So the first phase, this is not the order we want to do it in, but this is the order that it occurs in, is from storage into circulation. So storage, as we talked about, could be stored anywhere, but mainly we're talking about the organs, we're talking about the fat cells, and we're talking about the bones. If we have a backlog there, that is undermining the optimal functioning of our body. And yes, it is true that it would be better not to have that. Certainly in the case of the organs, that's pretty obvious. If we have a bunch of toxins saturating the organs of our body, like our liver or our heart or our thymus or our brain, that's not a good thing.
Well, yeah,
so getting those out.
Brain fog is a massive thing out there. So, getting those out would be, very, very positive.
So I'd say brain fog is more related to like what's in circulation, which we'll get to in a second. But general brain not functioning optimally, that eventually leads to Alzheimer's, or
Right.
For now is, memory issues, focus issues, mood issues, depression, all that kind of stuff is more what I put in the category of toxins being stuck in the brain. And that's less controversial these days. We used to think that mood issues, for instance, were down to neurotransmitter imbalances. I think there's still some value in that perspective, to be honest, because it's true that by altering neurotransmitters, especially via hormones, you can make someone feel a lot better. But generally what we're realizing these days is inflammation in the brain. That is more likely to be the issue. Now, what causes inflammation? Inflammation could be caused by an infection, but brain infections are not super common. So why have you got brain inflammation? Well, it's probably going to be either a poison or something that your body thinks is a poison, which we call like an allergy, right? So there are even though there's this blood-brain barrier that is your body's attempt to stop poisons getting into the brain, poisons absolutely do go to the brain. And, a famous one that we talked about before, for instance, is mercury, right? Especially certain forms of mercury. They go to the brain, they poison you, they literally drive you insane if they build up enough. And this used to be common when mercury is used a bit more freely. It's still common-ish now, even when mercury is strictly controlled. Especially, we put mercury in the teeth, which is not a million miles away from the brain. But anyway, so yes, we don't want toxins in the organs. We don't really want toxins anywhere. So we do want it to go out of storage into circulation. But. So how does that? Oh, let's explain how that happens. So, so we have all these cells making up all these different things, and then there is the circulatory system, which is for kind of transporting nutrients in, and then waste products out. But there's also the lymphatic system, which is like the body's sewage system, is the best way to describe it. And so while some of the waste goes out via the vein part of the circulatory system, most of it should be going out through the lymphatic system. And when you start releasing toxins from storage in various areas, it will be in those 2 places. That's where it will end up first. It will end up in the lymphatic system, and it will end up in the circulatory system. Now, if it ends up in the lymphatic system, that's fine, so long as the lymphatic system isn't overloaded and clogged. Just like a sewage system, it absolutely can get backed up.
I was going to say, yeah. How would we, 1, how do we know it's backed up? And 2, how do we keep it moving well so it doesn't get backed up?
Yeah, so the most obvious way that we can tell that lymph sewage system is backed up is through swollen lymph nodes, right? This is kind of famous. There various different places throughout the body, and You can get that investigated by like a massage therapist who specializes in deep tissue massage and stuff like that. They can tell you if you have swollen lymph nodes anywhere, and they can help it to move to some degree as well. Why does it get backed up there? Either because there's just too much toxicity, but actually it's less that and it's more dehydration, but especially lack of movement. And that lack of movement is you moving your body, but also you breathing properly. And so people who breathe in this constricted way from the chest, they're not activating this pump. So there's this pump from the abdominal region around the navel. Specifically, if you're breathing from that place, there's a lymph node right around there, a big one right around that navel that kind of pumps the whole system. It's not quite as obvious as the heart pumping the whole system, the circulatory system, but it's not a million miles away either. And so this doesn't necessarily mean deep breathing. We've talked about that in a different episode, but breathing from that area where your belly goes in when you breathe in and your belly goes back down when you breathe out. So inflate, deflate, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. So when that is not going on, when we're doing it like when our shoulders are going up when we breathe in, our chest is going out when we breathe in, that means the lymph isn't moving. And yeah, also just moving. We're designed to be walking something like 4 to 6 hours a day, to have, strenuous activity at least every now and then, running, climbing, throwing, pulling, all of that kind of stuff. And when we're not doing any of that, or maybe we're going to the gym half an hour a day, but otherwise we're not walking, we're sitting down all day and all the rest of it, that's still not enough movement. That's still not natural. And I've given advice before in different episodes about that, but I would say be standing and walking around whenever you can. That's, a simple piece of advice that, if you work in an office, fine. As soon as you have to take a call, put it on hands-free, get on headphones and walk around rather than sitting down. If you can, stand up and walk around. If if it's a choice of driving or walking, if you can do it, then walk instead of driving. All of that kind of stuff, right? Walk whenever possible. Anyway, so there's a lymph system. But to answer your original question, how can you tell? Other than going to see a practitioner and maybe have them point out that your lymph glands are overloaded, the answer is once that lymph system is overloaded, it will backwash into the blood. And so it's really dependent on how you feel. So how you feel is like the contents of your fat cells makes almost no difference to how you feel. The contents of your liver makes very little difference to how you feel in and of itself. The contents of your bones makes no difference to how you feel, etc., etc., etc. But what does make a difference to how you feel is what's in your blood right now. And so this is pretty obvious, right? If we inject you with a drug, it will make you feel something the moment it hits your bloodstream, right? That's pretty simple. If you consume something, a pill, it will make a difference only when and if it hits your bloodstream, right? Once it hits your bloodstream, then that's when it has the profound effect on you. So what is in your bloodstream is how you feel. That's the really, really important thing to understand. And so in order to go on to the next phase of detoxification, because so far all we've talked about is storage and removal from storage, the next phase after storage is processing. And then I'll just give the game away now and then I'll talk about it in detail. And then the last phase after that is actually removal or release. So it's remove from storage, process, remove from body. Those are the 3 phases from the most zoomed out level. And sometimes, of course, there's no removal from storage. Let's just take it in.
Put it away.
Have it. Well, or I'm thinking of detox. It's take it in, process it, remove it.
Right,
That's
right.
the other
For the
way of
water
doing
soluble things like that potentially.
And even fat soluble, as long as you're not overloaded.
Right.
But yes,
right.
often
Okay.
water. Yeah, exactly. So in order to get from storage to processing, it has to go, as I said, either through the lymph, but often that gets blocked and overloaded, or the other one is the blood. And the blood's actually the most direct way because the liver and the kidneys are constantly... kidneys are more filtering blood. Liver's also filtering, but more kind of doing a much bigger job than just filtering, also processing and doing a million different chemical reactions, turning one thing into another, controlling the level of this, controlling the level of that. It's doing a lot of stuff. But from the point of view of detoxification, for right now, let's just think of them as both processing that toxicity. So before we talk about that, let's just talk about what releases toxins from storage. So, because here is where it gets tricky. And this is where people often feel worse when they try and be healthy. And this is the biggest sad thing. The thing that makes me sad in the health world, honestly, is it's not people who, say they want to be healthy and then do things that they know aren't and then feel sorry for themselves. It's like, we've all done that, but that's your own responsibility, right? That's your choice. There we go. But the people who try, right? They do everything they're supposed to. They follow the guru's advice. They eat what they're supposed to. They do the cleanse. They do the whatever. And then they feel worse, right? Why is that? And not just do the cleanse when they exercise. I'm about to give you a list. So here is a list of a few different things, certainly not exhaustive, which release
toxins from storage.
Yeah, thank you. Toxins from storage. Number 1, fasting. We just talked about that. Number 2, reducing significantly the intake of calories. Number 3, reducing fat. So even if you eat, it is true that if you have like a diet of, 15% of calories coming from protein, 75 from carbohydrate, 10 from fat, you can survive just fine on that. And there are some people who push that diet as the best diet and the healthiest diet and all the rest of it. Obviously not the keto people, but the ones on the other side. But the thing is, even if that's good for you and the blood sugars are right and everything and all the rest of it, that is a diet that will cause more toxins to be released from storage. Less fat, more toxins released from storage. That's just the way it is. Other things, sunlight will start the process of removing toxins from storage. Red light, so people do red light therapy, stuff like that. That will significantly, if you're doing like the amount that people do of red light therapy, will remove toxins from storage. Exercise, I just spent a few minutes talking about how good it is. It will absolutely remove toxins from storage. Yes, it will help the lymph flow, which will maybe make things better, but it will also increase the level of toxins going out from storage as well, for various different reasons, but one of them being the one we talked about earlier, which is when you exercise, suddenly your body needs lots of nutrients very quickly, and so it starts breaking stuff down, breaking down muscles, breaking down fats to release more fuel into the system. Heat will release toxins from storage. Now, heat, if it causes you to sweat, will also release toxins from your body. So it'll do the last step of actually transporting toxins out. But nonetheless, whether you're sweating or not, especially if you're not sweating, all it's doing is releasing it from storage, but not from the body if you're not sweating. Vitamin B3, especially if it's high levels that some people take, but even the levels found in some foods, the more vitamin B3 you have, especially the active form, the nicotinic acid, which gives you the flush feeling if you have too much of it, that release it from storage, big style. Cold, just talked about heat. Cold, significant levels of cold will also release it from storage. Intense breathing, so hyperventilation specifically, will release it from storage, as will breath holding will release it from storage. So when I say intense breathing, hyperventilation, like a fire breath from yoga, that kind of thing, but also not breathing, that will do it as well. Any kind of breathing that is a combination of the two, like Wim Hof method, but like loads of other traditional yogic and other types of breathing practices as well, will release toxins from storage. Meditation has been found to release toxins from storage to some degree. What do all those things have in common that I just listed, Chrissy? Do you notice anything there?
Not in where you're going to go.
They're all things that are good for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I didn't see
all
McDonald's
things that are
on the
recommended.
list.
No. McDonald's will not release toxins from storage, nor will drinking alcohol, nor will smoking cigarettes, nor will doing cocaine. All of the kind of things that are considered, nor will, a high-fat diet.
These are all healthy habits and great lifestyle things to have and support and, have in a daily practice.
Yeah. And so you can see where some of the problem comes in, right? If a person is already overloaded and backed up, especially in their processing centers and in their excreting centers, or let's say releasing, because it's less of a gross word, if they're already backed up in the processing and releasing areas, and then they're doing activities that cause more toxins to be released from storage, where they're going to go? If the lymph is already overloaded, as it usually is, then it's going to go into the bloodstream. When it goes to the bloodstream, it's going to put more strain on the liver. It's going to put more of a strain on the kidneys. And remember, whatever's in the blood is how you feel, especially because it affects the nervous system and it goes to the brain. Yes, there is that blood-brain barrier, but it definitely doesn't keep everything out. So it will go, basically, a lot of it, that toxicity will go to the brain and you will feel terrible. So it goes back to your brain fog comment earlier. So I think this is more of a common cause of brain fog, is the level right now of toxicity
circulating.
In the blood.
Right.
Circulating. Could be other things, could be a lack of nutrients, like low blood sugar or whatever. But if we're talking about detoxing, then I believe usually it's this excess of toxicity in circulation. So this is one of the challenges and everything I just listed is either recommended in general for health, or often it's recommended as part of a cleanse or a detox. Remember?
Yes.
Because not everyone only teaches about diet, right? A lot of them say, you should do yoga, which is a form of, both exercise. You should do hot yoga, which is, and heat. Or you should do Wim Hof method, which is cold and intense breathing. Or,
hot and cold plunges, things like that. Yeah.
You should go in the sun. All of these are good advice, and yet all of them can make you feel worse in the moment if you have this situation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So then let's talk about the next part. So the next part is the processing centers. So the lymph is also a processing center. So the lymph, as well as being the body's sewage system, it's not only the body's sewage system in the sense of it's not only kind of tubes to transport toxicity to processing. They also do some filtering. And so then processing of toxicity. The other processing centers, so your kidneys, they will filter your blood specifically. So the healthier and stronger your kidneys are within limits, they will prevent you feeling bad. As the toxicity goes into the blood, the better that they're able to function, they all get it out again, bring it to the bladder, where it can then hopefully leave your body relatively painlessly. If it's too much, it may not be so painless. We talked about this recently where we talked about cystitis. If the kidneys are overloaded with that toxicity, then they may be weakened, which may cause the immune system to be tipped over into being in a more inflammatory state. So there may be inflammation there. Or, it also potentially makes the kidneys weaker to an infection, ultimately. But more commonly, the issue is more in the bladder and the urethra. So the toxicity, especially if it's acidic, is what I see quite often. Not all acids are bad in general, but when they're excessive in the urinary tract, they seem to potentially cause an issue in many cases. So the acidic toxins may be there, these water-soluble toxins. It's really water-soluble ones that are going to be coming out via the kidneys, usually, unless they've been conjugated and processed by the liver first. And so they can create a situation where the bladder and the urethra is, very inflamed on an ongoing basis, which they then call interstitial cystitis or whatever. That may have originally been caused by an infection, a chronic infection or an acute infection, may have been originally caused by toxins. But assuming you've got the infection under control, which often happens, the person still has the pain, the discomfort, and all the rest of it, that can often be because the bladder is overloaded with toxins. Only time you want to be breathing through your mouth is if you're talking. There is no other reason to be breathing through your mouth. It's funny that the word mouth breather is like an insult that almost everyone recognizes as an insult. I see a lot of people in Hollywood movies, especially women, are often depicted with their mouths open, breathing, and I don't know if it's supposed to be attractive, but I'm always like, oh, stop it. No, I know about this, but it's mouth breathing is bad for a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's terrible for oral health because it means that the inside of your mouth becomes dry, which means that There is less of the alkaline saliva bathing the whole oral area, which means that bacteria are more likely to thrive, create toxins, which are then poisoning your whole body. You're constantly swallowing their saliva containing bacteria, which means it's affecting the whole digestive tract, potentially, depending on how the stomach's doing and various other things. There's this, connection between gum disease and oral infections and heart disease that's, strong enough that mainstream medicine not recognizes it. So there's a lot of oral health, which leads to general health reasons that you don't want to breathe through your mouth during the day or, especially at night. But the other reason is just that it's far, far easier to over breathe when you're breathing through your mouth. So, because here's the thing, you have a natural mechanism that stops you over breathing, and it's in your nose. And so, from a Buteyko point of view, if your nose is partially blocked, that's your body saying to you, we are carbon dioxide deficient. So we are going to stop you from breathing too much.
Right, so that you can replenish and rebuild the stores of the CO2.
Yes. It's much easier to breathe too much through your mouth than breathing through your nose full stop. And it's much easier to breathe too much through a fully clear nose than a partially blocked nose. And so if your body thinks that you're breathing too much, meaning that you are deficient in CO2, it will block your nose to stop you breathing too much. And so what do we do as a response to our body's desperate attempts to preserve this precious nutrient? We bypass the nose altogether and we breathe through our mouth.
Yeah.
Or we, take decongestants and Sudafed and all that kind of stuff to kind of just which by the way, like a Sudafed is just like an adrenaline thing. It's just like a stress chemical. Because again, if you're in a life or death situation, then you do need to be able to breathe more. So we're kind of just tricking our body into believing that's going on to, again, force ourselves to be able to breathe more. And that's to assuage a different anxiety. Because again, as I said, if we both need CO2. So this is the thing that's hard to get your head around. You can both need CO2 and be starving for CO2, and yet at the same time be intolerant of CO2 and have anxiety as soon as your CO2 raises.
Wow. And the reason you have the anxiety because the CO2 is raising is because when we have too much, we feel like we can't tolerate it. So that it takes us into that state.
We think we're dying. We think we're asphyxiating. If our stress is high, we've just overeaten, or we're very unfit. Again, those are the three major variables. But again, applies for a lot of people these days, right? Most people, most of the time. So that's the challenge. And so if that sounds crazy, like why would nature do that? There's loads of examples of that, like in the biological realm and maybe in the emotional, psychological realm. There's so many people out there who need more love, and yet when people try and love them, it feels uncomfortable. It's not just CO2. There's loads of things that we actually need, but when we get them, we feel like, I don't like that. And so, CO2 is only one of those things. And so that's the problem with mouth breathing. Mouth breathing is a way of bypassing your body's desperate attempts to preserve CO2, which is arguably the most important nutrient, because you could say oxygen is the most important nutrient, but generally you're not likely to be deficient in oxygen unless you're in outer space or deep between the earth or in a sealed room for a long time and all the rest of it. That's not really the problem. And in fact, people who live in oxygen depleted environments, so people who live very high altitude, all their health outcomes are improved. They're actually healthier. They live longer. Pretty much in every dimension, people who live on the higher altitude with lower oxygen are healthier, greater longevity, better outcomes for almost every health condition. So the problem is not a lack of oxygen in the environment. The problem is a lack of oxygen getting to the cells, which is actually a problem of lack of CO2. Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense, because you could have the oxygen, but if you don't have the vehicle to take it to get to where it needs to, there's not much else you can do about it.
The increasing metabolism, if you see the body as a machine, which of course science has tended to do ever since Newton, then machines tend to wear out and you want to kind of reduce their use to, if you want them to extend their lifespan. Like with a car, you take it out as little as possible. You drive it as slowly as possible to some degree, right? You don't drive very quickly because that's using it up more quickly. And people treat the human body as if it's the same thing. So they actually want to, some people who are trying to extend lifespan, they want to reduce metabolism because they believe that then, there's this idea as well that you only have a certain amount of heartbeats. And so if you, do a lot of aerobic exercise and you get your heart rate right down, then you're going to live longer because you're using up less of the heartbeats or you're using them more slowly. The bioenergetic view, as I understand it, is that we are not a physical, we're not a machine. We're actually an energetic being, and that every system of our body relies on energy. And so we want to increase that energy. But there is a whole school of thought, of course, still that talks about reducing metabolism. I saw, I'm sure you're aware of Brian Johnson, and I saw a post of his recently where he was boasting that his core temperature was 35.5 or something like that. Sorry, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. 95 maybe, something like that. 94 maybe even. Like that was really a good thing. So could you address that a little bit? The idea that slowing your metabolism down is a good thing, because going back to, I know we started with omega-3s, but I think that's kind of related, right? Omega-3s are going to slow down metabolism as well as suppress the immune system.
Yeah, and they fit right into this conversation, and so does hormesis as well, right? I think his protocol is a really good example of what happens when we take the reductionism of how most hormesis research is done and then turn that into a protocol, right? And you end up using something like resveratrol, which failed miserably hundreds of millions of dollars later in terms of research, when it was supposed to activate these pathways that extend lifespan. And anyway, so when it comes to the fundamental question here, as you said, there's this view of the body as a machine that wears out with more use, and that's basically called the rate of living theory. And part of it is based out of that thought process. It's also based on the fact that has been identified, the observation that animals that have a higher metabolic rate tend to have much shorter lifespans, right, relative to their body size, right? So if we think about a mouse, which has a very high metabolism relative to its body size, it doesn't live very long compared to something like an elephant or us, of course, or apes or anything like that. So they then said it's just the high metabolism. It leads to that machine wearing out faster, and it dies sooner. And then we look at the caloric restriction research, which is so heavily flawed, and we come to the same conclusion. And that's called the rate of living theory. And it's missing some really important components. For one, it's not really in favor anymore scientifically. There are other theories I'll get to in a moment that are much more accurate representations of what's going on. But also, it's forgetting the fact that as a sophisticated organism, we're able to regenerate, right? So your car can't fix its own engine or fix its own tires or whatever other issues there are, regardless of how much fuel you give it. And that's not the case for us, right? When we have an injury, we can repair it pretty dramatically, and we're constantly renewing and repairing all the different cells in our body. And that is energy dependent. So it is not something where less energy just leads to less utilization. It also leads to less regeneration. And so on the flip side, if we're producing energy effectively and we have a lot of ATP available, we can function more efficiently with less damage, and we can regenerate the damaged tissues much more effectively. And that brings us to some much more accurate views of what drives aging, which are things like the oxidative stress free radical theory of aging and the membrane pacemaker theory of aging, which essentially say that a couple of things. One, basically, the more damage we're causing, the worse off we are. And that's the main thing that correlates with lifespan and aging. And when we look at something like a mouse, it has a high metabolic rate, but that's not because it is really efficiently producing ATP. It's kind of like we said earlier, looking at low carb versus high carb. It is producing ATP very inefficiently. And so it's producing a lot of reactive oxygen species for every ATP it produces, much more relative to us. And that makes it so that every time it's trying to produce energy, it has this extra cost associated with it. It has to use more fuel to get the same amount of energy, and it creates more damage to get the same amount of energy. And that's what causes the shorter lifespan and the faster aging. One of the main determinants of that is the amount of polyunsaturated fats and how unsaturated they are inside the fats in all of our cells. So all of our mitochondria are built with mostly fat. They have these phospholipid layers, and those are composed of different amounts of saturated and unsaturated fats. And basically the number one determinant or thing that associates with lifespan and aging is how unsaturated those membranes are. The more unsaturated they are, the less efficiently we produce energy because of proton leakage through the membrane, and also sodium, potassium leakage, which both of those reduce the efficiency of energy production and the increased susceptibility to damage and oxidation. Those few things together basically lead to a state where the more unsaturated our membranes are, the faster we age and shorter we live across all species. And that's because each species has a relatively standard amount of the amount of unsaturation in its membranes. Within a species, if we just look at mice, just look at chimps, or just look at us, or just look at a particular species of animal, the ones with the higher metabolic rates actually live longer, have less reactive oxygen species, and have less unsaturated membranes. And that's because within our kind of set point, we can vary. And so if we eat a low PUFA diet and improve our efficiency of respiration, and this includes omega-3s as well, the DHA component is actually one of the worst ones when it comes to increasing unsaturation of the membrane and causing inefficiency here. When we eat much less PUFA, we improve the efficiency of our respiration, we reduce the reactive oxygen species production, we increase the efficiency with which we create ATP, the same fuel coming in, and that is the number one determinant of lifespan and aging, both looking across species and then within species. So it's basically the exact opposite of what we were told based on the rate of living theory.
All right, well, the next one that we haven't talked about much yet, in fact at all, I think, is cell senescence. So what is this? Also known as the cell danger response. This is quite new in the anti-aging world compared to most of what we've talked about, but it's very exciting. There's a lot of research into it. So we talked about normal healthy cells. We've talked about mutant cells, which is your neoplasm, malignant neoplasms. But there's another type of cells that's very significant that, as I said, it's only fairly recently been discovered and focused on, and it's senescent cells. And another way of describing that would be zombie cells. So what these cells are they're cells that are not functioning properly, but they're also not mutating. They're not being broken down with autophagy, which is what should be happening to a cell that is not functioning correctly. So what are they doing? They're kind of frozen. And they're kind of frozen. They're also shut off. So they've banged down the hatches. They're not letting stuff in. They're not putting stuff out. They're just there in a kind of, like a stasis from a science fiction movie or something like that, right? They're just in a state of relative stasis. So this is also sometimes called the cell danger response. So the idea behind this
like
is...
I'm going to get it wrong. Is it the dorsal... The phase we've talked about all the time.
You got it right. Yeah, it's like a dorsal vagal cell. Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of shut down and in response to danger. So yeah, it's a very good analogy. And so the theory behind this is that when there is an actual threat, like a virus, because one of the things that a virus does is it comes in and kind of takes over a cell. I guess that's not a zombie. That would be what would that be? Like a body snatcher kind of thing or something.
Invader.
Yeah. So to stop itself being kind of body snatched, like that movie, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, what it does is it kind of just shuts itself down, puts a protective layer around itself so things like viruses can't get in. But the problem is also nutrients can't get in, waste can't get out. And so it just kind of hibernation might be another way of putting it. So the problem with that, of course, is if there's too many cells doing it, they're not doing their job, whatever that job may be, right? Like liver cells are not livering and skin cells are not skinning, right? They're just they're just in this shutdown state. And so the more cells that are not functioning correctly, I mean, we've talked before, not in this episode, but in plenty of other episodes about metabolism and how the slower the metabolism, then the slower a cell is performing its functions, which is also not good. But when we're talking about senescence, we're talking about not just slow, but the specific cells actually ground to a halt. So this is really not good. The cell's not doing what it's supposed to do. Now, normally when the cell's not doing what it's supposed to do, as I said, it gets broken down by apoptosis, which is done by the immune system. The immune system comes down and recycles the cell. But when the cell is senescent, it resists that as well because it's got this protective barrier around it in the same way that it's keeping out viruses, it's keeping out maybe heavy metals, maybe other toxins. Like it's protecting itself, but it's also stopping itself being recycled.
Yeah, it's kind of hunkering down. It's bedding in. It's like, okay, let me just wait for this danger to pass. But I'm assuming there isn't a notification to say, hey, the danger's passed, if the danger has passed, or there could be an environment where the danger's just not going to pass.
Yes. Yeah. Either the environment, yeah, exactly. Either the danger hasn't passed or the body thinks it hasn't. So this is the, chronic inflammatory response syndrome is one of the ways that that's kind of categorized, where maybe the infection or the toxin, even if it's not gone, it's kind of got down to a manageable level. But because it was so high or so prolonged, the body stays in this kind of emergency state. So yeah, the way you described it, hunkering down, is perfect. It's kind of like an endurer strategy.
Great point.
People like to talk about the liver and detoxing. Okay. The mistake that people make about the idea of the liver and detoxing is they think that somehow toxins hit the liver and the liver does its magic on them and they just poof disappear. Like they think it just means the liver just makes them disappear. That is absolutely not true. The liver will either put them straight into the bile. Like if it's toxic metal, it doesn't do much to it. It's just going to put it in the bile. It's going to put it in the garbage can, if you will, or the poop, if you. I call the bile the liver's poop. We'll get to that in a second. So it's either going to just put stuff straight into the bile, or it's going to run it through what are called detox pathways and change its form. So then hopefully it can either turn it water soluble, it could go to the kidneys to leave, or the hope is you're turning it into a less toxic form, which could then be put in the bile. Or there's a thing called biotransformation or intoxification. Instead of detoxification, it's intoxification. It's where when the liver runs a chemical through it, it actually becomes a more toxic molecule as it goes through detox. And then people say, why would that happen? Why would the body do this? Why would God design us to do this? Why? I don't know. I'm not the creator. I just observe it. So we have those things. So then how does the liver try? What is the best way the body has to get rid of these toxins? Well, it's the bile. The bile is the liver's poop. So the liver poops into the bile ducts. The bile ducts connect to the intestines, the small intestine, and then the small intestine is going to hopefully carry that out. Now, here's the rub. In most people, the standard American diet, it is stated that we are going to reabsorb. So this is the thing that people also make a mistake of. They think that like your skin will only absorb good things and it will try to reject bad things. Like our skin has like some sentient choice. They'll also tend to think that the intestines will not absorb bad things and will only absorb good things. This is absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. Your intestines will absorb practically everything they can possibly absorb. Same thing with your skin. That's why I tell people like stuff you're putting on your skin, if you wouldn't eat it, you probably shouldn't be putting it on your skin because it's going to be in your blood. Like the sunscreen study where they put 8 compounds from sunscreen on people's skin, and then they measured them in the blood the next day, and they saw all 8 compounds in the blood the next day. So when you put sunscreen on your skin, you're not just putting it on your skin, you're putting it in your blood. So with the intestines, as that bile is going through them, on the way hopefully to be pooped out, 95% of the bile is reabsorbed through what's called the enterohepatic circulation. So entero is guts, hepatic liver. So it's a specific circulation that's just from the guts to the liver. Think of it as it's like the entry into the nightclub. So it's the bouncer is the liver. So for everything in the intestines that's coming into the system, it goes into the enterohepatic circulation, then it goes to the bouncer. And the bouncer has to decide what to do with it. So you have this cycle, this enterohepatic circulation of bile and toxic stuff going into the guts, and then the guts are reabsorbing a lot of the toxic stuff, and it's going right back to the liver, so then the liver has to do that dance again. Okay. So by definition, the bile is the most toxic fluid in the body. It is concentrated toxicity from the liver itself that the liver's trying to get rid of. Other people on the internet are like, they always talk about how wonderful the bile is and how much you need it and you have to thin it and you have to do all this stuff. And I'm like, look, we just want the bile to be, the liver will do what it's supposed to do. If we just make it less toxic, we help it get rid of the toxins it's already stored, because your liver does store toxins. If you ever want to look it up on PubMed or look in the scientific research, they use the term accumulate. They don't ever use the word store. So search for the word accumulate or accumulation, and you'll start to find all sorts of stuff that the liver holds on to. And then the last thing is we try to put in the nutrients that the body needs to protect itself and to get rid of the toxins. That's like basically how we restore health. And all of those things together will help fix the bile problem that I'm about to describe. Let me give one example of one component of bile, which is vitamin A as retinoic acid. Your body wants to get rid of vitamin A. It stores it in the liver if it can't get rid of it fast enough. It stores it in the body fat if it can't get rid of it fast enough. It'll store it in the skin if it can't get rid of it fast enough. That's why people turn orange. And now people have sent me videos of liposuction doctors sucking out orange fat from people. Like, there's vitamin A being stored everywhere. Fatty liver is yellow. What color's vitamin A? It's yellow. Like, there's a vitamin A toxicity epidemic everywhere. So, and I've shown the data on that too. So, vitamin A, what does it break down to? What does it biotransform into or intoxify into? It intoxifies or biotransforms into retinoic acid. Multiple forms. But one of the most common forms that especially women know about is retinoic acid in terms of retin A, or what is called a yellow chemical peel. Note they say the color in it. So they would put this chemical peel on people's faces, and it was basically going to dissolve several of the upper layers, upper cell layers, and then it's going to speed up the turnover of cells underneath it, so that people get a little nicer skin for a while. That's it. So it's a big, huge trait. Now I want you to think about, if your cells were turning over too quickly, over and over and over again, wouldn't that be called accelerated aging? Right? So can't you do something short term that like people using caffeine? Short term caffeine may give you some energy. Long term, it makes you more tired. Well, if we were doing something to speed up the turnover of the skin so we look a little younger, short term, long term, it's going to age us. There is no something for nothing. But anyway, back to retinoic acid. It's dissolving cell layers. So, bile. Bile is how we get rid of vitamin A. Bile containing retinoic acid contains a chemical peel. This bile then, it can bust holes, dissolve holes in, eat holes in the liver cells that make the bile. I have that research. It can dissolve holes in the little teeny tiny bile ducts in the liver. Those two things together are called intrahepatic cholestasis, which means you are leaking bile from the liver itself directly into the bloodstream.
I thought cholestasis is where the bile was stuck. It's not moving.
So cola is related to bile, right? Stasis is stagnation. That's the strict definition of it. However, stagnation can also be, in this term, basically it means bile is going to the wrong places. Kind of like if a river wasn't flowing, it will be stagnant, but if it stops flowing long enough, it's going to back up the river, right? And find other places to flow. It's going to find the quickest way down. So the bile will do that
but
too.
The more troubling thing is that it's going into the bloodstream.
Yes. So intrahepatic cholestasis means leaking directly from the liver into the bloodstream. It's not even making it to what's called the big common bile duct, the big one. Like you think of your aorta or something like that. It's the big one. So the common bile duct can get holes eaten in it. This bile goes down there. Everybody in the alternative community is talking about leaky gut, right? But they never seem to have a good explanation of what is eating the holes in the gut. Well, I could tell you, I found research showing that the bile controls the tightness of the junctions in the gut. So the bile controls leaky gut. Bile is the cause of leaky gut. And then we get ulcers in our stomachs. Well, if you start looking into the research of acid reflux and bile reflux, which nobody ever talks about, the bile is eating the holes in the stomach. And I actually have research showing that because the stomach's made to absorb things, right? The stomach is absorbing bile. If bile goes up into the stomach, which is if you've got GERD or acid reflux and whatever you're doing is not working, it's because it's a bile problem and you're not fixing that problem. The stomach can absorb the bile directly through itself. I've got research on that.
Beautiful. Moving into the next controversial opinion, we have most of the people in charge are not like normal people. They're narcissistic or psychopaths. They do not have compassion or a sense of shame and feel superior and entitled.
Yeah, whoa, where's that come from? Thought we were talking about vitamins. Well,
Exactly.
the thing is, it has an impact on health. It's going to have a bigger impact on health in a way if you're aware of what I just said chronically, because you might be spending a lot of time worrying about it. But it has a big impact in your life as well if you're completely oblivious to it. So let's break this down. First of all, let me kind of justify that statement, I suppose, before I talk about the consequences of it and the effects of it. There's a lot of talk these days about how the government is intruding too much in our lives. And I tend to agree. My philosophy, if I had to have a political take, would probably be more like classical liberal or libertarian, in the sense of freedom of speech, personal responsibility, my body, my choice, like all of that kind of stuff. Things around an adult having personal responsibility and therefore also personal freedom to decide things for themselves, so long as they don't harm someone else. That's not really the direction the world is going in. The world is going in the direction of more and more top-down control, and they're talking about things like a social credit score and stuff like that. Why am I talking about that? Because it's amazing to me how much of our lives these days they try and control, and how much information they gather about us, both governments and also private companies. And yet, probably the most important thing that we could do to benefit this world, no one has even considered. Not just like some people promote it, but like it's unpopular or something like that. No one's even talking about it. So what am I talking about? So there is a small percentage of the population. Estimates vary, but let's say 1%, who would go under the definition of being psychopaths. So what is a psychopath? A psychopath is someone who is profoundly different from a normal human being. And most human beings get into a lot of trouble with this, because generally going through life and acting as if most people mean well, it's just that they may, be mistaken and be upset at the time and stuff like that. But acting like most people mean well is actually generally a good philosophy, because most people are not actually evil. Most people are actually good, and going around like paranoid, everyone's trying to hurt you and rip you off and is a very bad way of moving through life. Most people are basically good, and most people do want to help and are kind and compassionate, all the rest of it. But there is a very notable small percentage who are definitely the opposite. Now, I say it that way because there's a bigger percentage who are also need to be discussed. But let's talk about the obvious 1%-ish first. So these people in the psychological literature generally have been referred to as psychopaths. So what makes a psychopath? They have no sense of shame and guilt, first of all. So shame means, whereas you and I and most people watching probably are not going to do something because they would be afraid of the feeling they would get about everyone's judgment about that, they don't have that at all. They'll make a calculation if it suits their desires, their ends, and then they'll do it. There's no concern about other people's opinion or judgment. This can be perceived as a strength, especially in like the personal development world, shamelessness. Like most people think that they have a stronger fear of public speaking than death, right? This is like a famous statistic. And that's because so many people are like, oh my God, having like even 100 people's eyes all on me, judging me is just unbearable. I'd rather die. That's how a lot of people feel. So that's the sense of shame. Again, a small minority don't have that at all. And then in a bigger minority, it's very suppressed. But let's talk about the small minority first, the psychopaths. So they don't have shame. They don't have guilt. This is a very hard thing, again, for normal people to get their head around, because so much of our behavior is driven by guilt. Not necessarily that we're feeling guilt all the time, although some people do. They kind of feel guilty about everything. But I'm talking about more like, oh, I mustn't do this because then I'd hurt this person and I'd feel guilty. I mustn't do that because then this would happen and I'd feel guilty. I mustn't do this, right? So most of us are very tightly controlled by most of the things we could do, we don't do because then we'd feel guilty. So they don't have that. If they're not doing something, the only reason that they're not going to do it is because of the reprisal that they would get. And even that doesn't affect them that much because of the next thing. So the even more interesting thing about them is they feel way less fear and anxiety than normal people would as well. And this shows up in, so, the thing that would stop you doing something that would hurt someone else, first of all, it would be guilt. And second of all, it would be fear about the consequences. So they have no guilt and the fear of the consequences significantly reduce. Now, different psychopaths are slightly different. The most obvious psychopath is the type who, does something horrific to someone, kills them, whatever, gets thrown in jail. Maybe 30 years later, they're released. They go out, they immediately do it again, and they're back in jail, like within 24 hours. They make no attempt to try and hide the evidence or whatever.
There's no remorse, is there?
Well, there's no remorse, but what I'm getting at right there is there's no, even forethought, Like a Jeffrey Dahmer might be, very carefully planning, I'm going to do it this way and not get caught and stuff like that. I'm saying for a lot of the most obvious ones, it's just impulsive. There's literally no thought about the consequences whatsoever because there is no fear. There's no fear about ending right back in prison. There's no fear about being caught, right? Incomprehensible to most people. Now, some, okay, so it's fear. Now, what are these people? If you do not believe in anything, religious, even spiritual, if you're a materialist, I think the easiest way to understand them is just to say that they are predators. So they have a predatory mindset. Their main motivation is power, and the feeling of power. So, you say one of the most obvious ways to feel powerful in the moment is to kill someone because that's the ultimate power, deciding life or death. That's like being a god for a brief period of time. But that's a very, short-term rush. A more long-term thing might be, being the tyrant dictator of a whole people where, everyone lives and dies on your whims for the rest of your life. That would be a lot more satisfying. But that would require a lot more discipline, which a lot of the most obvious psychopaths do not have. They are too, because they have no sense of guilt or fear. They're very impulsive, very impulsive. Impulsiveness is one of the main qualities of the psychopath. There is this thing in psychology these days they call the dark triad, or now the dark tetrad. And so that's composed of psychopathy, by which in that group they really just mean impulsiveness. That's the main thing. Machiavellianism, which means manipulation or scheming, characterized by dishonesty. So saying something or doing something because you want to get a result, not because it's actually honest or true or what you really mean or think or whatever. And narcissism. And narcissism is qualified by self-centeredness, feeling like the whole world revolves around you, a sense of entitlement, and a diminished sense of personal responsibility. Nothing's really your fault. There is a broader category called narcissism, which more people suffer with. Narcissistic personality disorder, maybe 5%. The other is all psychopaths are narcissists as well. Most narcissists are not psychopaths. And we'll talk about the differences in a sec. But anyway, psychopaths. So those are the qualities of them in a nutshell. Some of them are very unsophisticated, like the example I gave of the person being released from jail, doing the same crime again, going right back, not even thinking about trying to cover their tracks. The more sophisticated psychopath who is not as impulsive, who is able to learn self-discipline, is the more dangerous kind. And they're the kind who are more likely to be in positions of significant power and control. Now, to go back to my point earlier about government surveillance and all the rest of it, and the crazy thing that no one's even talking about, let alone doing, you can actually see if someone is a psychopath or not with just a brain scan. It's, very highly accurate. I remember seeing a news article about someone who was studying psychopaths, and they looked at a brain scan and they're like, oh yeah, that's definitely a psychopath. And it turned out to be their own. And, and, when they thought about it, like, as far as we know anyway, they never committed any horrific violence acts or anything. But, when they checked in with family, colleagues, everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense, based on the way you behave. So obviously there is a spectrum here, just like there's an autism spectrum or there is a depression spectrum or whatever. Not everyone's in the same place. There is a psychopathy spectrum from, as I say, the most extreme, I'll just do it because I feel like it, obvious, violence, to the much more sophisticated. It is like, again, they're all driven by power, the feeling of power, but it's like, do I want the quick fix of just getting a high now? Or am I going to keep working in a disciplined way to end up in a position where, I can, whatever, release a poison into the environment that kills millions of people, or start a war that kills millions of people, or whatever, right? And then there's a whole spectrum or continuum there. So, as I said, this can be found with a brain scan. So, what I can't remember the word for it, but the basic type where they put a bunch of electrodes on your head, and I'll have to look it up, Chrissy. I can't remember the word for it, but there is a specific word. The kind that Dr. Daniel Amen does, where there's different colors and all the rest. You can just see certain areas are very active, certain areas are much less active, and that's characteristic of psychopathy. Specifically, I know they have much smaller amygdala. So amygdala is the emotional center of the brain, smaller and less active as well. So it's a genetic component to it, where it's actually smaller. And then there's definitely less neocortex activity as well. So those are two elements, if I remember. There may be other things as well. But anyway, it's identifiable to a high degree of certainty by a brain scan. This guy called Robert O'Hare, who did, pioneered a lot of research on this. And even if the arguments this is, well, it's not 100% conclusive, Elwin, okay. Well, here's what I would propose. Everyone should be scanned, or at least everyone should be scanned before they have any position of power to ruin other people's lives. Whether that's before they can take political office, or have a high level of influence in a business that has the ability to pollute or kill by one means or another, or whatever. Really any position of power. And if they test as that, I'm not saying we should round them all up and kill them, but I would say they should be under surveillance. The way that the government is surveilling everything that we do? Well, the crazy thing is this. The people who end up working in the highest levels of politics and intelligence agencies and all these other unaccountable agencies that are actually running the shots and controlling our lives, the ones doing the surveilling generally are the psychopaths. So and why? Because, what better way to, we talked about the power of the godlike power of, being able to poison 1 million people, or being able to violently kill 1 million people by starting a war or whatever. But what about having omniscience? What about having the godlike power of knowing every single thing about, billions of people on Earth, and then also being able to predict their behavior, which this surveillance is able to do, and then also, of course, be able to control their behavior, which they're already doing in many ways, and which they just want to expand and expand. This is the ultimate wet dream of all psychopaths throughout the ages. What these institutions are trying to accomplish, and they tell us it's because they're trying to protect us or keep us safe or whatever. But it's like one of my favorite speakers here says Name one case where the person or the institution doing the censoring have ever been the good guys in history. It's like people taking away people's rights. They're never the good guys. At best, it's like in history, it's like the case, let's say there was an area, there was a lot of fighting between lots of different rival groups, different fiefdoms, kingdoms, whatever. And then one person comes along and kind of unites the whole area, which often they do through mass violence. Then often, once you've won, then you declare, let's have an era of peace now. Let's take everyone's weapons away and keep everyone being nice to each other and not saying things that we don't want to hear and all the rest of it. So generally, at best, it's a now I've won and I control everything. Let's just keep it that way and have everything be nice and peaceful. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is let's control everything that you do and root out any and all attempts at subverting this wonderful peace we have and take these people and lock them up and kill them and all the rest of it. So why am I saying that this is important? Because so much of the world doesn't make sense to a lot of normal people who don't know this information. And one of the avenues that people get into this stuff is through health. Because, often you get a health problem or a loved one gets a health problem, you go to this place, often a doctor, they're not able to help. And then, you start going, so this food that they've been telling me is safe to eat is not? Why would they do that? Oh, this medicine that they told me is safe has actually got loads of side effects. Why would they do that? And then, people go down this conspiracy theory rabbit hole, right? And maybe they start blaming businesses, they start blaming the government, they start blaming this, they start blaming that. But I would say, beyond the institutions, what we have to understand is it's these people. And I said from a material point of view, probably the way to understand them is that they're predators looking to increase their power. But from maybe a religious or spiritual point of view, you could say that they're an embodiment of a force of evil, if you believe that there is such a thing. And the evidence I have for that, I think it's becoming more and more convincing these days. A predator wants to dominate and control and maybe even, yes, torture. And one of the dark tetrad elements of sadism, so maybe enjoying other people's suffering. But one thing a predator doesn't really do, as far as I'm aware of, is destroy its own habitat to make it inhospitable to even itself. That's not really a predator behavior. You could argue it's kind of a parasite behavior, that some of the worst parasites will do that. Most parasites are happy to just kind of make a home inside you and feed off you, but a few of them will actually just kill you. But even then, they usually have like a plan for spreading to other organisms and stuff like that. They're not, it's not truly suicidal. So the thing that tells me that evil should be under consideration and not just predatory is that, they're actually in the process of destroying their own habitat. And even you could say, human beings are a resource to them as slaves or entertainment or whatever. But they're destroying us, right? You can see that in the explosion of chronic disease and all the rest of it. And of course, you could say all that's accidental as a result of greed or whatever. But the more you dig into it, the more you realize that at least some of it by a few is intentional. And of course, I would say the part of it that's intentional, I would put psychopaths squarely behind it. So why is all this relevant to health and well-being? Because, as I said, I know a lot of people are resistant to this kind of stuff because, first of all, it involves challenging everything that they know, which can be scary. But I reckon a lot of people who watch this kind of stuff probably already into this stuff to a degree. But second of all, I think it can make you feel like you don't know where to turn and who to trust. And so I try to give guidance on that, like I did earlier in this, like how to tell if someone is maybe not trustworthy and how to tell if they are. And I think another thing is, we talked earlier about how having a toxic person in your life, like in your house, for instance, is going to substantially raise your stress, which will have negative health impacts. Well, how about having a group of toxic people make decisions which you absolutely cannot escape the effects of because they have a monopoly on violence. And what that means is, the only ones that are legally allowed to do violence is the government. What's the difference between, murder and not murder? If you kill someone, the difference is if you do it because the government told you to, then it's good. If you don't do it with the government's approval, then it's murder and you deserve to die or go to prison. So that's the difference. So, the government has a monopoly on violence, maybe rightly. I'm not going to dispute whether there should be any government that exists, but the point is that they do. And so if a government rightly or wrongly has a monopoly on violence, and then they get infiltrated and taken over with those who have a predatory stroke evil mindset, because there is nothing in place to stop that happening. And because, they've taken over not just the government, but the educational institutions, which teach you how to think, the media that teaches you what to think about whatever's going on at the moment, the medical institutions, like all of it, right? What if all of those institutions are not filled with, because it's a very small percentage of the population, but ultimately controlled by this group? It means that in order to make decisions for your health, you have to be very careful who you trust. And I think, again, I'm not quite sure, but maybe over 50% of people listening to this have already kind of got to this point of what I'm talking about so far. They already agree with what I'm saying. But then the other important thing to remember is just because someone is against that group or those institutions doesn't mean that they are good guys or they're going to help you either. So there is another group, I would say. So there's the psychopaths who are obviously evil or predatory to those who have eyes to see. And I think these days, the reason that I'm making the estimate that over 50% of people might already agree with this is because I think it's becoming more and more flagrant these days and harder and harder to not see. It almost seems like they're like, rubbing our noses in it almost, about how obvious it is these days. But, there is this other group of people called narcissists, maybe 5% of the population. And so, as I said, the difference between them is that a psychopath is primarily motivated by power and the feeling of power. Narcissist is primarily focused by attention and to some degree as well, approval. So a psychopath doesn't give a damn about your approval, which is why, they can go in court or in front of Congress or Parliament or whatever, and they'll just lie and lie and lie and be completely unfazed by it. They have no, everyone who's watching, they all hate them. Everyone hates them. They don't care. They really don't care. A narcissist, that's not actually quite the case. A narcissist would definitely rather be hated than ignored, but a narcissist would ideally be adored. That's what they really want. Now, again, it's like the word terrible is being ignored, quite good is being hated, and then great is being loved and adored and worshipped. Like they would still far, far rather be hated than ignored. But, that's still settling for them. What they really want is to be adored. And so often those people end up being what are called in the political sphere populists. So you have kind of the establishment, who are often dominated by either psychopaths or people who are being bribed or blackmailed or both by psychopaths. And then you have the kind of counterculture who are who are often called populists. And why they're called populists, it's kind of a weird term because in a democracy, you'd think that saying things that the majority of people agree with would be the strategy that everyone would use. But weirdly, most politicians don't say things that most people agree with. They through some other deceitful means they get in power anyway. But the ones who say what the majority of people believe, they're called populists because they are popular, and that's because they want to be popular because they are more likely to be narcissists than psychopaths. So often in the political sphere, you have the narcissists who are often more overtly objectionable. And then you have the psychopaths who often on the face of it seem, less objectionable, but actually when you look at their actions, they're even more horrific. And it's not a great choice between the two, honestly. Now, why am I talking about this? This is not becoming a political podcast. There's something not a million miles away going on in the health sphere, and that's why I bring it up, So you have the kind of establishment health world where it does seem right. And when I say health, I'm going to include agriculture and, environmental pollution, all that kind of stuff. It's all part of it, where it seems like they are really just trying to poison us. But then you have like the populists who are like just saying what people want to hear. Like, if you just eat this diet, all your health problems go away. That's to me is like the health equivalent of political populism. It's very popular. People love it, obviously. They often, books sell millions and billions of copies or whatever. Or, if you just fast, or if you just this, if you just do a juice cleanse, you'll lose weight, all of that kind of stuff, right? It's all very popular. It's all very appealing. But the people pushing it, again, they're probably narcissists rather than psychopaths. So meaning part of them does want to help. They're not purely predatory. But what's more important to them than helping is being popular and having your attention and having your worship and admiration and all the rest of it. And that's why often if you come back to them like, I tried the diet, didn't really work. They're like, you must have not done it right. Like, because again, a psychopath will just, won't care that it hasn't worked for you at all. They don't care about you at all. And narcissists is like, that hurts their ego that their system hasn't worked. And so they have to kind of like attack you to protect their ego, to like, it must be your fault, blah, 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 blah. So psychopath might do that as well, but it'll be a thing they choose to do. Whereas with a narcissist, it's more reflexive, like, how dare you insult my system, which is an extension of my ego. So we kind of have to be aware of that dynamic in every area. So I've mentioned politics, I've mentioned health, but every area where there is like a mainstream that is highly toxic, probably run by psychopaths. There's often a counterculture that is often run by lots of kind of narcissist gurus who are often telling you what you want to hear. Not necessarily because their primary goal is to deceive you or even make money out of you. Their primary goal is probably to get your love and your worship and your attention. And secondarily also to get money and whatnot. But I honestly don't think that is the main thing often in my experience. And I've known some of them and often they haven't accrued very much money, because they're spending so much money on their social media or their PR or whatever it might be. Like their goal really is to get your attention and their admiration. That's like the thing for them. And so, yeah, that's a very important thing to be aware of. Like, is the person who I'm listening to right now and heeding and trusting a psychopath, first thing. And then second of all, they're a narcissist. And yeah, in terms of my commentary about the whole world, I don't know there's a way yet to definitively screen for narcissism. It's more of a diagnosis, that's the opinion of like a psychiatrist or something. But with psychopaths, which are by far the most troublesome and difficult and damaging, we can actually screen for them. And if I think if the world wasn't actually run by them, that would already be the case. And if things ever change where they are no longer in control, the first thing that I would put in place is a system that says, maybe everyone, or maybe just before you get to any level of power where you have the power over anyone else, you have to prove that you're not a psychopath. And just to clarify, psychopaths have certain uses. Because they have such low level anxiety, there's certain roles they're really good at. Could be things like special forces or whatever, that's kind of obvious, or fighter pilot, because again, they don't feel anywhere near as much fear. But even things like surgeon, because they don't have that fear. They just have to be watched to make sure they're not killing people because they enjoy it. But they might well be more skilled at storytellers. Often writers and directors and all that kind of thing, because they're fantastic at lying. And what is a story other than a lie? In most cases, it's very entertaining. There's no one more entertaining to be around usually than a psychopath or a narcissist. Because they're so fantastically believable and entertaining and all the rest of it, because they can put you through that emotional roller coaster. So I don't think we should round them all up and put them in camps or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying.
I was going to say, let's clarify on those points.
Once they are identified, they just need the amount of constant surveillance that you and I and all normal people are currently under. should be removed and implied that we're already going through, right? Should just be applied to those type of people who have those kind of peculiarities to make sure that they are not getting out of hand and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed that, I recommend watching our latest episode, which you can do by clicking above, and make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment, and share with anyone who you think might appreciate it. Thank you.